Ancient Egypt, right. It's like everyone's favorite historical mystery. You've got pyramids, pharaohs, enough gold to make you think King Midas had a point.
Right.
But for this deep dive, we are so lucky we've got this text file someone sent in. And honestly, it's incredible. Super detailed, like someone's personal obsession with ancient Egypt just exploded onto the page.
Oh, yeah. It's amazing what people can pack into a simple text file. And this one, it's like a greatest hits of ancient Egypt facts and figures.
Totally. And not just the stuff you find in every documentary.
Yeah.
Like, did you know they used moldy bread to treat burns?
I've heard that. It's wild, right? Talk about early antibiotics or something.
It makes you wonder what else they were figuring out back then.
Yeah.
But okay, let's rewind a bit. The Nile.
Yeah.
Obviously, everyone knows it flooded. That's History 101. But this text file, it made me realize those floods were like the heartbeat of the whole civilization, not just for growing food.
Absolutely. Think about it. You've got this ribbon of green, right? Super fertile, cutting through basically desert forever. So it wasn't just crops. It was where you could live, where you could trade. Even how they buried their dead was tied to that river.
Wow. So it's like the Nile wasn't just a river. It was almost like the boss of everything.
In a lot of ways, yeah. And the pharaoh's power. It wasn't just about being chosen by the gods. It was tied into whether the Nile cooperated or not.
Because a pharaoh who can't deliver a good harvest, that doesn't end well for anyone.
Exactly. And that's where you get this corvée system the text talks about. Basically, everyone owed some labor after the flood, helped with these huge projects so things would be ready for next year.
So it's way more complicated than just like Pharaoh tells people to.
Oh, for sure. This whole centralized government, it was all about the Nile. Taxes were linked to how much you grew. It was this whole system. People, Pharaoh, the river, all connected.
Wild. Okay, so zooming in a bit, what about regular Egyptians, not just the bigwigs? What does the text say about their day-to-day lives?
Oh, that's where this text file really gets fun. It's got all these little details about food, houses, what they did for fun.
Which, knowing what we know about ancient civilizations, wasn't always a picnic, I'd imagine.
You'd think so, right? But they actually had board games, music festivals. They knew how to have a good time. But just like today, how you lived depended on your place in society.
Ah, yes, the social ladder. And I'm guessing it wasn't an escalator to the top for most people back then.
Yeah, more like a pyramid, literally. At the top, obviously, the pharaoh, royal family, all that. But then it gets interesting. The text mentions this white kilt class.
White kilt class? That sounds kind of chic, honestly.
Right. So picture this. High officials, scribes, the ones actually running things. And they wore these linen clothes, bleached super white. Only the elite could get it that bright. It was totally a status symbol.
It's funny how some things never change clothes make the ancient man.
Totally. And then you had your artisans, craftspeople, merchants, and of course at the base, the farmers who made everything possible.
So, pretty standard, you've got the powerful and you've got the people providing the power. But one thing that surprised me in the text was how much agency women had in ancient Egypt.
Right. That's one thing that really sets them apart. Compared to other ancient cultures, Egyptian women, they had options. Owning property, doing business, even divorcing their husbands.
No way. That's incredible for that time period. It really paints a different picture than you usually imagine.
It does. And then if you look at the rulers themselves...
Female pharaohs, Hatshepsut ruling like a total boss. It makes you rethink everything, you know?
Absolutely. It shows you that even in these ancient systems, things weren't always as black and white as we think.
It's amazing how much this text challenges those like Hollywood versions of ancient Egypt we've all got in our heads, you know?
Yeah.
It's easy to get stuck on the giant statues and forget there were actual people living their lives underneath it all.
Totally. And speaking of mysteries, this text file goes into some serious detective work when it comes to the genes of these folks' archaeogenetics.
Oh yeah, that's a whole rabbit hole, right? It seems that every other week there's a new study about where ancient Egyptians came from. So what's the latest scoop, according to this text file? Have we cracked the code on their ancestry yet?
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? It's a constantly evolving field. But the text does a great job explaining how archaeogenetics can map out migration patterns and family trees going way back.
Okay, so what are we seeing? Are we any closer to pinpointing where they came from originally?
The text makes it clear that while modern Egyptians, they definitely share ancestry with those ancient folks, tracing it back to a specific place and time. That's still a bit of a puzzle. There's a lot of research and debate happening.
Sounds like a jigsaw puzzle with a few pieces missing.
Exactly. But even with the pieces we do have, it's fascinating. Some studies suggest a connection to the Levant, that's over in the Eastern Mediterranean. It makes you think about migration and interaction thousands of years ago. And then you have others pointing to the Horn of Africa, like maybe there's a southern origin for at least some of the ancient Egyptian population. It's really interesting how different the theories are.
Yeah, it paints such a different picture depending on which one you look at.
Right. And the source stresses that with every new discovery, our understanding could change. It's a field where today's big idea could be totally flipped on its head by something someone digs up tomorrow.
That's what I love about archaeology. Always something new to find.
Yeah.
Okay, but shifting gears a bit here. No talk about ancient Egypt is complete without the gods, right?
Yeah.
What does the text say about their religious beliefs?
Oh, their beliefs were a huge deal. We're not talking about just a Sunday thing. This was woven into their entire worldview. Government, their daily routine, everything.
So more than just popping into a temple every now and then.
Way more. Their pharaoh was practically a god king. Their art was full of religious symbols, even their understanding of space. It was all connected to these beliefs.
Wow. And at the heart of it all, obviously, the gods themselves. Who are the big names in the Egyptian pantheon?
Well, you've got your classics. The text mentions Osiris, ruler of the underworld, all about rebirth. Then there's Isis, his wife, associated with healing and magic. And of course, their son, Horus, the falcon god, who symbolized protection and royal power.
A falcon god.
Yeah.
That's pretty badass.
Yeah.
So how did regular people, interact with all this?
So, unlike some religions where anyone could go to the main temple, Egyptian temples were a bit more exclusive. The inner sanctuaries, where the really important statues were, that was mostly for the priests.
Like a VIP area for the divine.
Exactly. But that didn't mean regular people couldn't connect with the gods. The text talks about house shrines, amulets for protection, personal prayers. Religion was everywhere.
It's like their whole lives were surrounded by it. And of course, you can't forget about the afterlife. Mummies, tombs filled with treasure, they took it seriously.
Oh yeah, their burial practices were super intricate, and it all went back to their spirituality. Mummification wasn't about, just keeping the body looking good. It was about getting it ready for the journey to the underworld.
Which, knowing what we know about their beliefs, probably had some pretty high stakes.
Absolutely. They believed that when you died, you faced judgment, and the goal was to become immortal. So, to help with that, they were buried with all sorts of stuff they might need. Provisions, goodies for the afterlife.
It's like packing for a really, really long trip.
Right. The text mentions furniture, food, even these little statues called shabtis. These weren't just decorations. They were supposed to be your servants in the afterlife.
So even in the afterlife, nobody wants to do chores. It's pretty funny when you think about it. But what about their influence on the wider world? We're talking about a huge civilization. What impact did they have?
Their impact was massive. We see echoes of ancient Egypt all over the place. You've got Roman architecture, the art and writing of the Kushites in Nubia. They even took Egyptian hieroglyphs and made their own version.
So their reach went way beyond just their borders.
Absolutely. It wasn't just about conquering, though. It was about sharing ideas and cultural stuff. Their knowledge, their art, it spread far and wide. And it didn't stop in the ancient world either. The text even talks about Egyptomania. That was this wave of obsession that hit Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries.
Like everyone wanted a piece of ancient Egypt.
Totally.
It seems like ancient Egypt never really goes out of style. But even the biggest empires, they don't last forever. What brought down such a powerful civilization?
Like a lot of empires, their story has its ups and downs. Internal struggles, economic issues, and of course pressure from the outside. People wanting what they had.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that nothing lasts forever.
For sure. They face threats from everywhere. The Hyksos, this foreign dynasty, they took over parts of Egypt for a while. Then came the Assyrians, the Persians, and eventually the Romans. They delivered the final blow and ended their independence.
So with the Romans, that's the end of ancient Egypt as we know it.
Politically speaking, yeah. But their legacy, that's still going strong, kind of like their monuments. It's incredible how their achievements, their innovations, their whole culture, it still fascinates people today.
Like you said, they never really go out of style.
Right.
And this text file, it's a perfect example of that.
Yeah.
But there's one last thing I wanted to touch on, something the text brought up that really got me thinking. The idea that how we see ancient Egypt, it's shaped by how we've looked for it all along,
Yeah.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? Like, we've been talking about their houses, their beliefs, even what their DNA says about them, but how we even know any of this, that's a whole other story.
It is, yeah. For a long time, interacting with ancient Egypt wasn't about understanding. It was about, like, taking.
Yeah.
The source talks about how these early expeditions, even when they had scholars along, they were all about claiming artifacts, claiming knowledge, you know.
Like finders keepers, but with history.
Right. And sadly, that kind of thinking, it affected everything. Museums, how they did archaeology, even just presenting history like it was already decided.
But the good news is, it sounds like things are changing.
Yeah, definitely. There's this whole movement now about working with local communities, respecting that it's their heritage. The text actually mentions the Egyptian Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities. They're super involved now, making sure excavations are done right and discoveries are shared in a respectful way.
So less about outsiders calling the shots and more about a global effort to learn and preserve, which is amazing.
Exactly. Recognizing that these aren't just objects, it's a living culture, deserving of respect, not just us poking around in it.
Which, I don't know, makes me wonder, what would an ancient Egyptian think about all this? Us studying them, writing about them, putting them in movies even.
It really puts it in perspective, right?
Right.
Imagine someone from that time seeing how we interpret their lives, our museum exhibits. Would they even recognize themselves?
Or would they be like, you guys totally missed the point?
Probably a little both, honestly. But what I find hopeful is that even after all these centuries, people are still drawn to ancient Egypt. We're curious, we debate, we want to connect to that past.
It's like proof that some things are timeless. Right.
Totally.
In a world that's always looking ahead, it's kind of cool to look back and see that a civilization as seemingly far away as ancient Egypt, well, they still have things to teach us.
Absolutely. And who knows what we'll discover next?
Right.
What new ways of seeing things. It reminds you our understanding of the past is always changing, just like history itself, I guess.
I love that. Well, on that note, thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Always fascinating stuff.
My pleasure. Always a good time talking about ancient Egypt.
Until next time, everyone, keep exploring.